Good afternoon. I think it's very good morning here where I am in London, and I'm delighted to see you wherever you may be, somewhere in China, I think, and to talk to you about a subject that's always meant a great deal to me, opera. Question one, and you can think about this, and don't ask me because I don't know the answer. What do we actually mean by opera? What is opera? It's simply an Italian word. It means a thing, a work. If you have any other European languages, opus, it's originally a Latin word, œuvre in French. There's no way of defining what opera is. It's the attempt to combine all the arts into one: music, drama, poetry, costumes, people pretending to be someone that they're not really, chorus. And in a sense, I suppose all civilizations, all cultures have done that. I certainly don't know enough about Chinese opera. I wish I knew more. But historically, I dare say in ancient Chinese times, there were grand religious political ceremonies in which an emperor would dress up in this and so on. Ancient Sumeria, ancient Egypt, ancient Babylon, medieval Europe, in the great churches, at Easter time or whatever. In my own country, in Britain, when there is a royal coronation or a great celebrity dies, when the Queen dies, there will be a grand occasion with people in formal costumes, things being sung, things being held, perhaps a cross or whatever it might be, and the crown and so on. So, and is a popular musical an opera? So a bit with music, bit of dance, bit of singing, few words here and there. When I was starting to lecture about opera and writing about opera, people said, well, when did it begin? And I had a silly answer. The answer was January the 1st, 1600. What I meant was that towards the end of the 1500s, what we think of, what we call the Renaissance, in Italian, the Rinascimento, the rebirth of what they thought of as the world of ancient Greece, the ancient world, according to Europeans. They were trying to recreate what they thought the ancient Greek world was like. And when a great Greek dramatist, Sophocles or Euripides or whoever, had a new thing at a great festival in ancient Athens, the crowds would come to see it and to hear it. And it would be a play in which people were dressed in costumes of mythical times and so on. And there would be costumes and what we call props, properties, and scenery, and a chorus, and musicians. And in the late 1500s, particularly in the northern courts of Italy, I don't know how well you know the detailed map of Europe, but there was no nation called Italy, but there was that long peninsula going down into the Mediterranean. In the north, there were some quite wealthy cities, Florence, Milan, and so on, governed by great dukes, and they were all rivals. And every now and then, one of them would have a great ceremony. His daughter was being married to the king of somewhere, or they just won a great military victory, and all the other dukes would be invited, and they put on a special show. And they tried to make it multimedia, with all the media, every kind of art form combined. And that gradually got known in Italian and then internationally as opera. So when I kind of joke about opera beginning in the around 1600. Of course, if you and I were chatting informally over a cup of coffee or a drink, which I wish I could do, and I said, oh, you know, my wife and I were going to the opera tonight, you'd probably think, not 1600, you'd probably be thinking something written in the 1800s, perhaps by Rossini or Verdi, or, you know, most of all, we think of opera as being something performed, written. The highlight, the top of the opera history is largely 19th century, I suppose. We think of, let me get myself off screen and try and get you some pictures. We think of 19th century buildings. This is Covent Garden, the great opera house in London. When it opened, you know, it was imitation ancient Greek, imitation classical style, and it opened in the 1850s. And it's been renovated since, and I've been there many, many times in my life. This is the great Paris opera house, the Opéra, which was initiated in the 1860s and opened in the 1870s. This is the inside of Covent Garden, very much a 19th century kind of theatre. And the shows they put on there, they might be historic, the subject might be historical, it might be some kind of medieval song contest in Wagner's Die Meistersinger. But Wagner and his operas are 19th century. I mentioned Verdi, the great Italian composer, born the same year as Wagner, 1813, and he would write an opera about a Renaissance period, Catholic, counter-Reformation, Spanish king, or an opera which would be called Don Carlos. But that too is actually written, composed, and here produced as though in it looks as though it was Renaissance Spain, but it's written, created in the 19th century. Let's go back a bit. Let's go back to the origins of opera, what we call opera. And as you remember, I was saying that essentially the attempt to create this multimedia art form like they thought they had in ancient Greece really dates from the late 1500s, early 1600s. And you find that in Florence. If you're interested in art history, art and culture, oh, Florence, isn't it wonderful, the home of all the great artists and architects and so on. In some ways, it could be quite scary. We're talking the 1500s now. They would burn books that they didn't like. There was the Catholic Inquisition that could be very cruel to people who weren't honorable believers in the Roman Catholic Church, and they would burn people. There were martyrs who perhaps were reformist or whatever, and it was quite scary. I mean, the most famous political philosopher of that time and place was Machiavelli, who told you, if you read Machiavelli, you know, if you're a prince, this is how to get your way. Murder that rival, lie to this one, cheat there, make lots of money, look as though you've got a grand palace and they'll all obey you. So it's a difficult kind of a place. But it also had a great deal of art and a great deal of music. One of the cities nearby, a city-state with its duke, was the city of Mantua, Mantova in Italian, not terribly far away from the other ones that I've mentioned. And the musician-in-chief of that particular one was Claudio Monteverdi. As you see, I've got his dates there, 1567 to 1643. And if you read most basic books on opera history, you'll see the first great opera was Monteverdi's Orpheus, an ancient Greek myth, Orpheus and Eurydice. You may know about it. It's Orpheus and his beloved lady friend Eurydice. She tragically dies and she goes to the underworld, hell, whatever it might be. And he somehow learns that if he plays the lute, music's very important, and if he plays the lute, he can somehow talk his way into the underworld and bring Eurydice back to life. And his opera, it wasn't an opera, it wasn't even called an opera. It was a story to music, and it was put on by the Duke of Mantua in this palace, the Gonzaga Dukes, because they had a kind of celebratory week. They were inviting all the other local important dukes, and they were all going to go hunting, and they were going to eat and drink, and they were going to have merrymaking of various kinds. And before the grand dinner, there was an entertainment with the finest of the Gonzaga Dukes musicians writing the music, and somebody else doing the scenery so that it could all, when somebody comes out of heaven or goes to hell, you actually see the movements and the trees all move in to suggest a forest. A multimedia event in which the music was by Monteverdi and the text was by somebody else and so on. We nowadays think of an opera as being by a composer. They didn't in those days. I'll tell you what it was like. It was like a spectacular public event to impress all the others who were there from other cities. I remember, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I remember, you had the Olympics in China in, I think, 2008. We had them in London 4 years later. And I remember the opening ceremony on television before the Olympics in London in 2012 was a most spectacular television show with images of the Queen and this, that, and the other, and it was a one-off event to impress everybody around the world how wonderful London was. And I must say that when Orfeo, this was the program, as it were. It's a favola in musica, second line down, a fable to music. And yes, the music was by Claudio Monteverdi. It was put on in Mantua. This was published sometime later when Monteverdi was much more famous. Let me just give you an idea of the style. It actually begins, yes, it's a great moral tale about life and death and the profundity of love and so on. But it's actually a political event. And as the Duke of Mantua entered, the opera begins with a fanfare welcoming the Duke and all his ducal guests, men only, the dukes and so on, in a room in that great palace, not a theatre. Nobody in the streets of Mantua had any idea that all this was going on. And it opens with a nice fanfare. So let me just give you an idea. And then it goes straight into a woman singer comes on and sings, I am music, musica sonio, and music is the deepest thing, that, etc., etc. So it's all very ceremonial. When people try to describe, oh, do you know, I was in Mantua recently, my lord, and we were very privileged. We went to this wonderful, I don't know what you call it, a thing, a show, an opera, blah, blah, blah. And gradually the word opera caught on after that. Interestingly, Monteverdi, who, as you saw, he was about, I don't know, 40 or something when he wrote the music to this, but he was a bit fed up, he was overworked. His real job was to write the church music for every week or any ceremonial, or if there was a funeral or a marriage, his job was to write the music. And he wasn't paid very much, and he was overworked and didn't really get on with his boss. And he got himself another job. And he lived to be quite elderly, by the standards of those days, well into his 70s, and he moved to another northern Italian city that was not run by a duke. It was a commercial city, trade, commerce, a holiday center. People, we can't travel around the world taking holidays at the moment. I'm talking to you at a very unusual time when there's, certainly in my own country, there's no opera being produced, but we may come on to that later on. Monteverdi moved to Venice, and Venice was a lively place. People from Europe used to go on what they called the Grand Tour, and they would go to Venice and they would go to this, and they would find some nice young lady there who'd show them around and so on. And the main central square in Venice is there today. It's empty at the moment because there are no tourists, but normally it's packed. And if you look at this image from the kind of period that Monteverdi was there, and you'll see top left, there are people on the platform there sort of playing some music. There's somebody right in the middle there with a guitar. Lots and lots of tourists wandering around at the bottom. They're all staring at what the hell's going on. They're probably being invited to put some money in a hat so that the musicians make a bit of money. And at the back, there's St. Mark's, the great cathedral, the Duomo of Venice. And Monteverdi's job was to be the head of music at the Duomo. But as I say, this was a very commercial city. And therefore, Monteverdi, every now and then, they had commercial theatre, where the job of the man in charge, the impresario, was to put on shows that people would go to and pay money to go to. Very much like modern theatre in a way. As I say, the person from Britain or the German world or the Spanish world or wherever it was who went there to have a good time during the carnival period would, find some nice Venetian lady they could take to the opera and maybe have dinner with afterwards. It's very funny, the two people at the back are wearing masks, not because of the plague, the COVID, the coronavirus that we're all worried about at the moment, but in order to disguise who they were. You used to put a mask on so that people couldn't realize that you are actually the Duke of this or the Lord of that. Otherwise, you wouldn't dare get up to all the things you're getting up to. So they wore their masks and they went to see some glamorous, famous prima donna like Anna Renzi, and she would make sure that she got a great big fat fee for singing. And she wouldn't go to most of the rehearsals. She would dress in how she looked best and make sure that whatever she was singing, it included an aria that she could sing that everybody loved hearing her sing. It wasn't as though there were strict operas and you had to perform exactly what there was. They usually had a bit of dance, they usually had a bit of this, that, the other. And there was beginning to be stars who made big money. Opera began to kind of spread around the world. It crossed the Alps, the mountains to the north of Italy, and you begin to get some of the great wealthy courts of Europe, like that of in Paris, in France, King Louis XIV, Louis XIV as he was called. He was the one who moved to the great palace in Versailles. And they didn't call them operas, they called them something in French, drame, or avec musique, or whatever it might be. Here is where they're building up the Palace of Versailles, and it's going to be the biggest, most spectacular palace, court, gardens in the whole of Europe. And the king, Louis XIV, he comes to the throne, he's very young. And he lives right through till 1715. You can see, he was already king when he was very young. And he got known as Le Roi Soleil, the Sun King, because he once put on a funny costume and danced when he was young. But it also meant throughout his career that he was the sun. And we are all the small planets that bow and scrape before the great sun that gives us light and heat. And he controlled the arts. He controlled music in particular. He had a young Italian-born musician called Giovanni-Battista Lully, who Frenchified his name as Jean-Baptiste Lully, who more or less contemporary with the king, although as you see, he died a lot earlier. And Lully's job was to control music, control opera. Every now and then, the king would do what those Italian dukes had done 100 years before. He would invite all the important grandees, not just from around Paris, but the whole of France. And they would all come and stay at Versailles, and they would all be incredibly impressed. And Lully's job was to organize, put on, compose the music for a massive multimedia entertainment, the like of which nobody had ever seen anywhere else. And they'd all go away and they'd think, my goodness, the wealth, the talent, the culture. There were famous playwrights there, famous painters. The gardens were done by a famous gardener. And this is where opera really became very big, very grand, and very political. One thing I have to emphasize to you on the history of opera is it's not just works and famous composers and famous singers. It's such an expensive art form. Who commissioned it? Who paid for it? Who were the audience? How did you behave when you were the audience? Why did people not look at the stage, but look at other people in the theatre, if it was in a theatre? It was very often in the open air, in the grounds at Versailles. Could you hear properly? Presumably, the more important you were, the nearer you sat to the king, i.e. in the middle, somewhere near the front. But if you were at the back, at the side, you were just a minor, the youngest son of a duke from provincial France. You probably didn't get to see very, very much. Let's get away from all these sort of political power leaders and opera, and I want to fly you through history, get in a little helicopter together, and I want to fly you over the channel to the north of France into my own country, my own city, England, London. London, and we're now in the 1710s, 20s, 1720s, 1730s. London then was very, very much like London now. It was a very big city by English standards. It was the biggest city in Europe, maybe the biggest city in the world. Who knows? They didn't have the direct numbers in those days. But in 1710, 1720, London had a population of more than 500,000, probably 600,000, something like that. And a lot of immigrants, not coming by plane or by train, but of course up and down the River Thames. They were very noisy. A lot of people resented them. Why don't they go back to where they came from? We don't want all these bloody foreign immigrants. Other people said, oh, they're more than welcome. We need the labor. We need them to help us with all our jobs. So there's all that going on. Great wealth, great poverty, a lot of drugs. But in those days, it was mostly alcohol. It was mostly gin. Famous painter Hogarth, who painted people getting drunk with gin. And you get some idea of the noise and the mess and the variety of people there. And remember, when we talk about immigrants, one of them was a young German boy, Protestant, reformist, Calvinist German lad. He'd learned his musical skills up in Hamburg in the north. There was no united Germany. And he traveled around and he'd gone south to the Italian peninsula. He networked very cleverly. He got to know Catholic cardinals. He met some Italian musicians there. I don't think he spoke much Italian. Eventually, he lands up in London. And his name was Handel, or Handel, originally Georg Friedrich Handel, half anglicized George, which is English, Frideric, Handel, and he was born in 1685, the same year as another German composer, Bach. They never met, but they were born the same year. And Handel lived again a good life. He didn't die till 1759. And he wrote a lot of operas to Italian texts. Italian was the trendy language for opera. I don't think he understood it very well. People used to laugh that he spoke English with a very strong German accent, a very strong German accent, but they could kind of understand him. And he wrote the most wonderful, beautiful music. Don't imagine that opera, I keep reading these cliches, opera, Handel took London by storm. He was the greatest. You know, most people didn't know who he was. Most people didn't know what opera was. In a city with 600,000 people, the theatre in which the Handel operas were performed held 750 people, maybe 900 if you include all the servants at the back who were bored and waiting to take the audiences, members of the audience home. But some of the music is wonderful. People made fun of opera. They always have. You know, the big fat prima donna, the castrato, and so on. A wonderful cartoon a little bit later of both the singer and the audience. And you see the audience yawning, laughing, coughing, talking to each other, can't hear properly. I mentioned the castrati, sensitive territory here, the castrated male. Remember, think back to the Italy I've talked about, the Vatican, the church, the Catholic Church throughout Italy, particularly in the more southern parts of Italy. They would have a church choir, but it would be all male. And all the beautiful high notes in the hymns would be sung by young boys whose voices hadn't yet broken. And the good ones sometimes found that the church, or perhaps the young boy's father, would agree to have them castrated, demasculinized, so that the voice would remain high throughout their lives, so that they could remain in the choir and earn some money for the old mother and father. Castration, thankfully, ended many, long time ago, a couple of 100 years ago. And I don't quite know what the voices were like. Don't confuse the sound of the castrato, the male castrato, with the modern countertenor. I mean, I can, my normal singing voice is la da 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 da, but I can sing in a falsetto voice, which is not castrated, but the castrato, apparently the really famous ones, the good ones, had tremendous, powerful ring to their voices, which was in its own way very exciting to hear. And they became very famous, and they also got laughed at. Here are two of them. You know, they've two Italian castrati of the kind of Handel-y kind of time. Little childish heads, enormous chest resonance with which their almost childish voice could enormously resonate across a theatre. And in the middle there, you've got an Italian prima donna, the chief woman, the head woman, Italian opera singer. And they got resented. Remember that the England, the London, the Britain of Handel's time, the 1700s, was very scared of Catholicism, very anti-Catholic, anti-popery, a lot of anti-foreign. And a lot of people would see opera of this kind and think, well, why are we putting all this stuff on for the rich people who want foreign, Italian, Catholic singers singing in a language nobody here understands? Why don't we have normal, good English? They're doing our boys and girls out of a job. Why don't we put on shows? We've got very good young British English boys and girls who can sing and can act And this, in a way, gradually took over. You may have heard of the Beggars opera, put on originally in 1728 and painted the next year by Hogarth, whom I mentioned, the great painter of that period. The Beggars opera, I mean, opera's about a beggar. Operas are supposed to be about emperors and kings and queens and ancient biblical subjects. And here is a popular, it's a musical. It's got dialogue in English and nice popular tunes that everybody can sing. And it's not about a grandee, it's about somebody, he's not a beggar, he's actually what's called a highwayman. He leads a group of criminals who stop coaches and rob them and perhaps kill the people in them so as to make, and they make some money. And he in the middle, he's going to be jailed. You can see he's got leg irons on, he's probably going to be hanged. And he's got not one girlfriend, but two girlfriends, Lucy and Polly. And they're each begging their father to let him off. He loves me. And the other girl says, oh no, he loves me more than he loves her. They are caricatures of the Italian prima donna. And it's also political satire. It's a brilliant work. And it was far more successful than any opera by Handel. A Handel opera might have 10 or 12 performances over the course of a month or two. Beggars opera was on pretty much every night for 60-something nights, 62 nights, I think. They didn't have to sing too hard or too loud. There was a lot of speech. Half the audience, as you see, they're not really watching. They're just there for entertainment, a bit like going to a jazz club or something. And, you know, when the exciting bits are on, they all watch the stage. And the man who ran this was a theatre manager called John Rich. And everybody made the obvious joke. He became very, very rich by putting on this show. And you know what he put his money into? He decided to build his own theatre right overlooking the Covent Garden square in London, the piazza, the Covent Garden. And that was the origin of where the Covent Garden Opera House is to this day. There have been 3 different buildings, 2 of them, one burnt down, was rebuilt, then another one did, and then there was the one today. And here is John Rich. No, he's not. Come on, John Rich, where have you gone? Entering his theatre, Rich's glory, his triumphant entry into Covent Garden in 1732. And it didn't even open with an opera. It opened with a play, and 2 or 3 times John Rich managed to get Handel. Oh, Mr. Handel, we'd be so honoured if you'd write an opera for us, and they'd put that on, fine. Opera came and went a bit. It was travelling around. There was opera in due course in Russia, at St. Petersburg, in Madrid, all across Europe, and it went through different phases. Times it was popular, times it wasn't. And as I said at the outset, the real heyday, the summit of opera performance, production, creations, probably not until the next century, the 1800s. But again, let's jump into the historical helicopter, and I want to take you away from London and away from 1732. And we're now in the 1780s, and we're in Vienna. And a word or two about young Mozart. Lived a short life. He never really made it beyond his mid-30s. We all say, oh, how tragic that that genius Mozart died so very young. And of course it was. But people did. Many famous artists, many famous musicians. Some you'll know about. Mendelssohn, Weber, Chopin, a great many of them. Schubert died at this kind of age. Schubert didn't even make it to 30. The other ones I mentioned, like Chopin, you know, they got to around 40. People died. They didn't have the medical things we have now. I'm of a very lucky generation to be talking to you at this age. Mozart was brought up by his dad. His father was a musician and composer and expert on the violin, and they were born in a beautiful town called, well, they lived in Salzburg. Gorgeous, lovely, lovely place. And, but the dad wanted to show off his son and make a bit of money out of his brilliant, clever little boy. So he took them to Vienna, where they had an audience with the Empress of the Austrian Empire, brought them to London. Dad and Mum and Wolfgang and his sister, the family came and lived in London for about 15 months. Just 3 or 4 years after Handel had died, the sort of 1760s, when the kid was 7, 8, 9. Went back to Salzburg, basically they were servants of the Archbishop. And little Wolfgang got fed up with all this, and eventually he goes to Vienna, the capital of the great empire, the Habsburg Empire, and he wants to make it big in the biggest, most important city there is. And he does his best, and he writes this and that and the other when he's asked. There was quite a nice emperor by that time who says, well, you know, nice to meet you, young man. Why don't you get together with so-and-so who's a good poet, and you can write an opera, and we'll put it on in the Burgtheater, the state theatre, right there in the middle of this picture. The doorway on the right goes through to the great square and the whole royal or imperial palace. That theatre isn't there now. It was moved and rebuilt on the outskirts of the main town. But that is where, for example, the wonderful opera, The Marriage of Figaro. Wonderful, wonderful, witty, brilliant piece. There's lovely music. Let me just play you a little bit. That was where it was premiered in 1786. Just a few years note before the French Revolution. And it's slightly revolutionary. It's about a count, as kind of a duke, an important person, and his servant, Figaro, has a girlfriend, Susanna, who's a very pretty girl, and they're going to get married. The whole thing is called The Marriage of Figaro. But the Count, he thinks he can have her first. And Figaro and Susanna won't hear a word of it. And in fact, the Countess and Susanna, the girl, they get together. They're going to catch the Count out. They plan a little letter together where the Count is going to be invited to meet, he thinks, Susanna, so he can do what he wants with her. But actually, they're going to catch him, surprise him, and he's going to realize what a fool he is. Here's a lovely recording. There are no recordings from the 1780s, but this is one of the earliest recordings I could possibly find, made in 1903, of that wonderful duet between the Countess and the servant girl who are planning to catch the naughty Count. basically the countess is dictating the letter and the girl is writing it down, and then they begin to get together, and then they finally sing the whole thing together over a jolly good laugh. Mozart was successful, but he could only make, he didn't have a regular income of any kind. If a grandee invited him to come and play for them at some big dinner party, you know, they all applauded and he was given dinner and a little bit of a fee. And then he went back and hoped that somebody would do the same for him later in the week, or that somebody would commission another symphony or opera or concerto or sonata. There was no regular income in those days for a composer unless you worked for either a political authority or a church authority. Very difficult times. And he ran into problems when the empire went to war with the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire, and when there was a new emperor and all that. He was, you know, his letters are desperate for money. He's not writing all about music, but he's worried about money. And as I say, he dies very, very young. He actually is a bigger star outside Vienna, in one of the imperial local capitals. This is the Estates Theatre, in a small town that belonged to the empire, a small town called Prague, which later becomes the capital of Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic, and so on. And that theatre is where his opera Don Giovanni had its world premiere. And the theatre is still there. If you're ever lucky enough to go to Prague and there is opera on, which there isn't at the moment, you may well see the 9 millionth performance of Don Giovanni in that very, very theatre. And then everything breaks down. The French Revolution, the Revolutionary Wars, the Napoleonic Wars with Napoleon marching his French troops right across Europe. And those wars go right on until 1815. Not a lot of opera when the whole of Europe has conquering armies marching across it. A little bit, but this is the Bastille, the great French prison that was invaded by the revolutionaries in 1789. And you get somebody like Beethoven, born right in the middle of all that, or a young adult in the middle of all that. He lives between the kind of classical Haydn, early Mozart period and into the romantic post-Napoleonic Europe. He does write an opera. He writes an opera called Fidelio, Fidelity, about a woman whose husband is wrongly in prison and she dresses up as a boy in order to join the prison staff and try and get him out. Not very successful. It's got wonderful things in it, but you can understand why Beethoven, who was a difficult man living through very difficult times, and of course he's a great composer and he goes deaf. He's a romantic. He looks to a kind of visionary future where humanity will, I don't know what he thought it would do, but he's certainly not going to write another opera. Spend 3 years writing something very complicated with no possibility of it being performed anywhere. Not a chance, no point. But think of what we mean by the Romantic era. I keep using these words like Renaissance or Baroque or classical. Romantic is the idea of the individual expressing individual feelings, being at one with nature, nature with a capital N, and so on and so forth. Just look at a painting, same kind of period. We're now 1820 or thereabouts. A German artist called Caspar David Friedrich. It's not just a man and a woman have been for a walk and they're coming out for their breakfast. It's humanity emerging from a dark, militant past and Napoleonic wars, and there's going to be a wonderful future. And there was a period of optimism. Interesting, let me take you on the helicopter again to somewhere we haven't been yet, except I mentioned it, and that's Naples, the big city in southern Italy, just above the kind of, Italy looks like a boot, and Naples is just on the way down to the the foot of the boot. And Naples in the 1820s, in the 1830s, after all the wars, after the defeat of Napoleon, it's a great cultural centre, a great musical centre, and a great centre of opera. There's a theatre there, the San Carlo, St. Charles. You can just about see, I think, Teatro di San Carlo. Still there today, part of what was once the Royal Palace. You can see in the middle there the castle within the Bay of Naples. And the man in charge of it in mostly the 1820s, 30s, used to commission a lot of opera. This is a great sort of theatrical centre. And he would commission opera and have the composers there in residence, maybe for a year or maybe 5 years. And among people who created these new operas were Bellini, the young man on the left, Donizetti, the older man there in the middle there with the score and the pen, and the jolly fat Rossini on the right there. And they were capable of producing a style of opera that got called bel canto, beautiful singing, beautiful music. And it was, I mean, basically the orchestra would be going, and the singer would come in singing above all that. And there were some wonderful examples of operas of that kind. For example, Lucia di Lammermoor, Lucy of Lammermoor, based on a romantic novel by the Scottish author Walter Scott. And she is forced, this poor sweet girl, to marry somebody she can't stand because she's got a secret lover. And she is forced to marry this man, and she actually, in a mad rage, kills her. Then she has a great mad scene in which the soprano is able to show off like mad. Here's another very early recording. This is the singer Nellie Melba singing a little bit of the mad scene from Lucia. She goes on like that. I mean, you've got to be pretty mad to be able to sing like that. But it's an astonishing kind of art form, and people loved it. People went to the opera for social reasons. You know, this young girl, not looking at the stage, she's looking at Sir George, some important person opposite, whom she hopes has noticed her. People went to opera for political reasons. When the emperor visited the opera, you were supposed to dress properly. And if you left your hat on, you obviously had no respect for the emperor, and one of his servants would knock your hat off to make sure that you knew your place. Belgium, little country Belgium, headquarters Brussels, it became independent in 1830. And that very year at the opera in Brussels, there was an opera put on about a great revolt, about liberty and this, that and the other. And it fed into the desire of Belgium to be, you know, and Holland and so on to have their own independence. And you find somebody like Verdi, the great Verdi, my great hero. Sometimes when I'm miserable, I try to look like him. He lived to be my kind of age and was very serious and earnest. And he got very involved in the idea of Italian unification. All the Italian people should be in one great nation. And he went on throughout his life being a great creator, a great composer. He's the Shakespeare of opera, but he was also a landowner, difficult man. And I know that you've been studying Shakespeare. I sat in on one of the lectures the other day, and Verdi wrote 3 Shakespeare operas: Macbeth, when he was much younger, Otello, based on Othello, of course, and Falstaff, who's one of the characters, one of the comic characters. He wrote that when he was nearly 80, Verdi. But Otello is probably one of the great operas of all time. A word or two, incidentally, rather than stop and take questions now, I'm going to suggest that if you've got any questions for me, let me know, maybe email me or Georgina or something. And then when we kick off again tomorrow morning, I can answer some of the things that you've been asking about. So let me just run through, if I may, for a few more minutes. One of the things that I said I would talk about is the difference between a play and an opera. A play like Othello or Hamlet have, I have no idea how many lines, but probably something like 3,500 lines, a lot of text. An opera can't have anything like as much text. You heard that mad scene just now. She was saying all of, 10 words from start to finish over a 5-minute or 6-minute aria. Otello leaves out the whole of Act 1 of Shakespeare's Othello and begins with the storm, in Act 2 of Othello. There just wouldn't be time to include all the language of Shakespeare, but it's the most wonderfully compact multimedia art form based on Shakespeare's Othello. Oh, no, maybe I won't. Maybe we'll move on. Let's go back to Milan. Verdi becomes incredibly famous. He becomes very, very famous, partly because by his time, there's copyright law, there's publishing, there's photography, all the things that in Mozart's day didn't exist. Here is La Scala Milan, the great theatre, and the wing on our side of it that you can see sticking out on the left is where the Ricordi publishing company were based, who published Verdi's operas. And they sold them all over the world. I've got vocal scores of Aida. I played you the Grand March from Aida when we opened. And there's the vocal score. It's what the singers have to do with piano accompaniment. And in both cases, it's published by Ricordi. And there's a famous picture of La Scala Milan from the time of Verdi on the cover of the score. This is a brass band in the 1870s in America, in the West, somewhere in Nevada or Utah. They could easily have been playing a brass band version of the Grand March from Aida, and they could have bought the score as a piano piece or a brass band piece from a shop in San Francisco by that time. Operas were getting bigger, orchestras were getting bigger, choruses were getting bigger. Wagner's writing great, grandiose, big operas. A painting of him here by Renoir. You might think of Wagner as only doing very big, noisy pieces, but he also wrote the famous Wedding March that you might know. Wagner born, note, the same year as Verdi, 1813, although he dies a lot younger than him. Opera production is beginning around this time. You didn't just get a famous singer standing out in the front belting out an aria. You begin to get, well, you stand over there, you be in this costume, you need to move over there by the time you hear this particular piece of music, and so on. And we'll bring this morning's thing to an end shortly. I mentioned the opera singer Melba. Here's the other famous soprano of that time, Adelina Patti, very celebrated. I know you've also been studying Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, and you should know there's an opera based on it by Gounod, who wrote Faust. And Patti was the very first Juliet in 1867 at the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden. Opera by the late 19th century is a celebrity culture. People like Patti are famous like today's pop stars. She gives a concert at the biggest hall in London, and it's packed, the Royal Albert Hall. When celebrity leaders from other countries come to England, Queen Victoria will take them to the opera. Queen Victoria loved opera, even had it brought to her own palace when she was elderly. There she is, watching an opera that she has ordered to be brought to Windsor Castle. It traveled around the world. It went to America. Lots of Italians migrated to New York and then across America, because there were railways across America by now. The Metropolitan Opera New York, the first one, was built, opened in 1883. And at precisely this time, we're getting the beginnings of the work in the really the end of the century, by 1900-ish, slightly before, of the most famous Italian opera composer after Verdi. And he's a very casual, easygoing, nice chap, and his name is Giacomo Puccini. And that's about the most formal picture of him I've ever seen. Okay, I've talked for far too long. At least I've shown you some pretty pictures. I hope I played you some nice music. I'm going to stop there. Tomorrow, I did say that the center of opera was really 19th century. And we've talked about everything from Rossini and Donizetti to Wagner and Verdi and on, and I mentioned Gounod and others, and Puccini. We'll start by talking about Puccini tomorrow. And one of the things I want to talk about, in addition to the fact that almost all his operas are named after the central woman in the opera, for reasons we can talk about, Puccini becomes the richest, most successful, at the same time most talented, in my opinion, composer of his time and possibly of all time. And he also, his final opera, which he died before he completed, is a sort of extraordinary image, or a Western image of the grandiosity of ancient China. The opera is Turandot. I'll say a little bit about that tomorrow. Meanwhile, thank you for being with me today. Sorry, no time for questions. Email me, phone me, text me, talk to Georgina, and then she can secretly tell me what you're worried about. And I'll try and start with that tomorrow on time. I won't play music first. See you at my 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Thank you for being there.
Thank you so much. Can we have a virtual round of applause? I know it's not quite the same as a normal one, but thank you so much, Daniel. We'll take. I'll see if anyone wants to ask a question for the rest of the day, and then I'll let you know tomorrow morning if we get any questions. Thank you, everyone. I'll see some of you in half an hour. Thank you again, Daniel, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.